Hey everyone, we're back again for Peak Human. I'm Brian Sanders. I'm the founder of sapien.org and nodestotale.org. Thanks for leaving this podcast a review, sharing with friends, and going back, listening to all the old episodes. So many good ones. Don't sleep on those. If I don't have a new podcast each week, go backwards. I'm telling you, they're good. Today, I'm talking to Stephan Guyenet again. He's a PhD. I had him on a couple years ago. He was awesome, wanted to follow up on a few things. He has a BS in biochemistry at the University of Virginia, and he has a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Washington. He went on to study neuroscience and obesity and eating behavior as a postdoctoral fellow. Spent a total of 12 years in the neuroscience research world studying neurodegenerative disease and the neuroscience of body fatness. His publications in scientific journals have been cited more than 3,600 times. He wrote The Hungry Brain. He now continues to be a science communicator, and he is the founder and director of Red Pen Reviews, which publishes the most informative, consistent, and unbiased popular health and nutrition book reviews available. I had a fun time talking to him about all the things to do with why people overeat, how to be healthy long-term, the genetic side of things. We get into visceral fat. We talk about satiety per calorie. He was into this stuff a long time ago. The brain regulation of energy intake and food intake, all kinds of stuff. It's great. He believes in the Sapien framework. Check it out. Let me know what you think. Hit me up at Food Lies on social media, Food Lies YouTube. Check out all our great stuff at nodestotale.org. Get that regenerative meat, and we'll see you next week. Okay, Stephan Guyenet, back again. PhD, how's it going?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, well, I want to go back to the basics of my Peak Human. I just love talking to nutrition nerds about things and people who are just in the literature, doing studies, writing great books. You know, that's what I love to do, and I hope the audience loves that as well. We're going to answer some questions, I think, that are pertinent to the audience and not just down in the weeds, right? Like mainly people go, how do I be healthy, right? How do I like lose a little fat, have a little better body composition, right? Isn't that pretty much on everyone's mind? You can go really deep in the weeds, but let me tell the audience who you are. Give us a little recap of Hungry Brain, because on the first episode, we went into your book, Hungry Brain, and just a little recap, what you're into, what you're doing lately.
Yeah, so my name is Stephan Guyenet. My background is in neuroscience and obesity research. And I was in the academic research world for about 11 years and ultimately decided not to stay in academic research. And since then, I've kind of maintained a partial role as a science communicator. In other words, I'm doing a few different things, but one of them is continuing to be a science communicator, particularly around the issue of obesity and related metabolic issues. And the Hungry Brain comes out of my kind of being in that field of research and seeing all of the really important things that were coming out of it and weren't getting translated to the public. And I feel like I'm kind of the lucky person who got to write that book, which was the book that needed to be written at that time to help people understand the link between the brain and body fatness, which I think is not necessarily intuitively obvious to people, but it helps to recognize that the brain is the organ that generates all behavior. And so if you think any behavior is related to body fatness, like eating behavior, like physical activity behavior, sleep, stress, anything like that, then you have to accept that the brain is playing a central role in that. And furthermore, the brain is the only organ in the body that contains a regulatory system, only known organ that contains a regulatory system for body fatness. So, so I was the person who got to write that book, and yeah, I think that's about all I have to say about it.
Well, it's a great book. I suggest people read it. I was listening to you on a sort of another science podcast about different models of obesity or fat gain, or there's the energy balance model, there's this CIM, carbohydrate insulin model. There's do you have a specific model that you think about, and how does the brain fit into that? Because it's very interesting to look at the brain. Some people have the adipose centric model. It's like, it starts in the fat tissue, or does it start in the brain? Give people an overview of the different ideas out there.
Yeah. So at the time that I wrote my book, the term energy balance model had not been coined yet, but my book is aligned with that type of model. Basically, the concept is we have so obesity, to accumulate energy in your body in the form of fat, you have to either increase your energy intake or decrease your energy output. Just, that's just physics. In fact, it's just arithmetic. Um, and so then the question is, how does that happen? How does more energy come in than is leaving? And then I take the neuroscience explanation for why our energy intake is higher than it needs to be to maintain a lean body. And I think there's a pretty good story about that I talk about in my book, but basically it revolves around brain systems that drive us to overconsume that are either non-conscious or only partially conscious. And these are brain systems that evolved a long, long time ago to ensure that we got an appropriate energy and nutrient intake in the deep ancestral environment. And, things like brain regions that regulate your hunger. Like, you don't choose what your hunger is going to be, right? That's just something that arises and you experience. That is actually the result of complex neurobiological processing that's taking all these different inputs, integrating them, and then putting out this output, which is your motivational drive to eat. And so you're not choosing that. You're not flipping a switch in your brain that says, I want to be hungry now. That computation is happening outside of your awareness, and then you become aware of it once it happens, and that is part of what determines how much you're eating. And similarly with cravings, you don't decide, hey, I want to crave chocolate right now. That's just something that arises as a result of these computations happening. So there are all these different brain systems that I talk about in my book that are non-conscious or minimally conscious brain processes that impact our eating drive and basically evolved to help us in this ancestral situation, but they're driven out of whack by the modern food environment, I think, is the basic story. And there's more to it than that. There's like physical activity and sleep and stress and stuff. But I think the real core of it is how our current foods and food environments are interacting with the brain systems that determine our food intake. So that's an overview of my version of what's now called the energy balance model. And it's, I know some people are going to listen to this and they're going to think, oh, that's calories in, calories out. That's baloney. And I think a little nuance is helpful here because, first of all, an important thing to understand about this model that I haven't talked about yet is that it actually involves changes in the regulatory system for body fat and appetite. So it's not just a passive, we're not talking about a spreadsheet model where, you go in and enter the number of calories in and the number out and then hit minus, and it's like, this conscious mechanical process. There are regulatory systems involved that are getting dysregulated as this process happens. So it's not really the simplistic calories in, calories out model that most people imagine. But nevertheless, it is boring but true that calories in and out are a powerful determinant of body fatness. And so even if you don't like the idea that, that we should be focusing on calories in, calories out, even if that doesn't appeal to you, it still is nevertheless true that if you eat more calories, you gain fat. If you eat less calories, you lose fat. And that there are, food environments, and the way that those interact with our brain that cause us to either eat more or less.
Well, that's the big thing. It's the why. All right, jumping in real quick to talk about nosetotail.org. We got our new website up. Hopefully, it's a lot easier to use. We'll make it easier to get out your meat to you. We have the body care products as well, made from beef tallow. If you haven't tried us yet, check out nosetotail.org. We have amazing products straight from ranchers doing great work. And if you've tried us before, we have a whole new system now. Things will get smoother. It's a lot easier to do our little boutique operation here, trying to get the good products out to you. We're not Amazon. We're doing our best. And we use the best producers. So check it all out, nosetotail.org. We have free shipping options. You'll love our products. Thanks, guys. The math, the pure math, it doesn't even tell you anything. You're just like restating the problem or restating what's happening. Oh, yeah. Right? It's like, yes, people understand that. But the main thing is why? No one wants to be fat and sick, yet we've ended up here. No one wants to overeat. So the real question is why? And you answer that. So you're one of the people that are like, okay, I will tell you why. Why did someone eat too much when they didn't want to? So we can get into that and more of your model, but also just if you want to throw in more about carbohydrate insulin model too, just to let people know that is a thing that people think. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'll talk about it a little bit. I don't want to like turn this into me like bashing another model, but it's not a model that I subscribe to. I'll say that up front. And there you can envision different versions of it. The one that I really think is hard to swallow is the idea that elevated insulin levels are the primary cause of obesity. I could get into the reasons, but I'll just leave it there for now. I think the evidence doesn't support that. If you want to say that elevated insulin is having some kind of impact and maybe could be contributing along with other factors, I think that's a lot more plausible version of it. And I don't think that has been necessarily refuted. And so, yeah, the idea there is the way advocates have phrased it or have conceptualized of it is that the energy balance, the calories in and out, are actually downstream of this fattening process that's driven by insulin signaling. So basically, you have insulin that's acting on your fat tissue or other tissues that is causing a fattening process biologically, and that fattening process is causing you to eat more or expend less or whatever. And so it's kind of an attempt to reverse the causal direction. But it gets kind of confusing because you don't gain fat if your calorie intake, if your energy balance doesn't change, you don't gain fat. So it can't be entirely downstream. It has to be upstream and causal, because if your energy balance doesn't change, you can't gain that fat. At least not significant amounts of it. So it gets kind of complicated to, I think, make it make sense. But that's how it's conceptualized.
Well, yeah, I think years ago, I think I believed in that a little bit more, and now I don't. And it does seem to make sense, but it's like, yeah, this probably isn't the biggest factor, because my whole thing is like no holes in my game. If you heard this term, there's like no holes in my game. You don't want to believe in something, but then there's these gaping flaws in your arguments. It's like, so now my new, not that I'm perfect and that I know everything, but my new kind of understanding of nutrition, there's not really holes in it. Like there's no black swans. It's like you show me someone who's 95% plant-based and they're eating, some seafood and they're healthy. I'm like, yeah, great. They're healthy. I get it. I know why they're healthy. They can be healthy. It
Yeah.
doesn't ruin my model. So, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I think if the model is that carbs are the entirety of the problem, then you're going to have a lot of trouble explaining certain observations. And you're going to come up with all kinds of implausible ways of trying to make it make sense. But yeah, the cognitive dissonance goes away if you accept that in the right context, carbs can be compatible with leanness and health.
Sure. Oh yeah, absolutely. So then what is your kind of model? Like what do you have an overarching view other than the brain stuff, or you could just go into your brain stuff too of like, why do people overeat?
Yeah, I'll just reiterate what I said. I mean, at a high level, it's that we have these brain systems that determine, and I'll give you specific examples to make it concrete, but the high level is we have these brain systems that determine our food intake and also regulate our energy expenditure and regulate our body fatness. And those were designed for a very different food environment and very different types of foods than what we're eating today. And basically, those brain systems were designed to seek energy, like lots of it. And because energy was harder to come by in the ancestral environment. Like if you imagine hunter gatherers, their full-time job or almost their full-time job is getting food. And so and it's a physical thing. Like, the women are out digging tubers, harvesting plant foods, maybe some small game. The men are out often hunting small or large game, or maybe harvesting plant foods as well. And like you're having to work to do those things, right? It's not necessarily backbreaking labor, but it involves, some physical
Oh, I did it.
activity.
I went to Tanzania
Okay.
2.5 years ago. It was backbreak. I mean,
Oh, was
we
it?
almost got dehydration and like didn't make it. Well, one guy almost didn't make it.
Wow. So I mean, that's the other
Well,
thing. There's a risk element involved too to foraging. There's
they had
effort.
an easy time. Sorry to butt in again, but yes, they
Okay.
had an easy time. They're very used to it. They can go out. They didn't even bring water, get animals, and come back. So it's somewhere in between where yes, they're very good at it. They can get animals, even in the modern environment where there's not many animals, and they don't have their old ancestral environment of giant animals. But yes, it was a journey.
Okay. So yeah, and there's the effort and there's the risk, and you have to have that intrinsic motivation to get the food. You have to be strongly motivated to get food to, get your butt out there and get it, right? Like, and that's the ancestral situation is your brain has to be wired to make you willing to work really hard to get that food. And in the modern environment, it's super easy to get food. And it's super easy to get calorie dense, easily digested, delicious food. And so basically, the effort barrier is almost gone. And the things that make food more attractive to the brain have been absolutely maximized through the process of consumer choice and refinement of industrial processes and home cooking processes. Technology and affluence basically is the root of it. And um and those things just and those are good things, right? Like in a lot of ways those are good things, those are things that we want, but they have this side effect of tending to cause us to overconsume. And so just to give you a concrete example of that, we have a system in our brainstem that regulates satiety, or the fullness that we feel within and after a meal. And satiety, or more technically satiation, is the main thing that causes you to terminate a meal. And therefore, it's the main thing that determines your meal size. And so it's a big deal in terms of how much you're eating. And we tend to intuitively think that we just kind of eat until the stomach is physically full and there's no more room. And then that's when we stop. But in fact, human stomach has a huge capacity. And typically, we're not even filling it halfway with each meal. So it's not your stomach capacity that's determining whether you feel full. It is your brainstem that is saying you have eaten enough given your body's energy needs. And so it's doing this actually really complex computation based on all kinds of signals coming from your digestive tract that tells it how much and what you have eaten. And so it turns out that different foods, it probably won't come as a surprise to anyone, but different foods can create different levels of satiety per calorie. So some foods, it takes a lot more calories for your brainstem to say, okay, we have reached that point of satisfaction, of satiety. And other foods, it takes a lot fewer calories. Like it can be half as many calories, and you reach that same point of feeling full. And if you look at the foods that are the least satiating, it kind of lines up with what your intuitions would be. It's like the junky foods, pizza, bakery, baked goods, cupcakes, donuts, candy, white bread, stuff like that. And if you look at the foods that are high satiety per calorie, it's more the unrefined, more ancestral foods like uh, fresh meats, whole grains, fruit, um, eggs, foods like that.
A potato.
Potato, yep, potato is was the most highly
It was-
satiating of 38 foods that were tested in 1995. Um, and yeah, so it's yeah, so essentially that's just a concrete example that if you choose these foods that are more have more satiety per calorie, and those, I think, not surprisingly, tend to be more unrefined foods that are more like what our ancestors used to eat, more like what the brain is adapted to. Those are the types of foods that will tend to guide you toward a more appropriate calorie intake without you having to really think about that. So again, we're not talking about the spreadsheet model where you're counting calories and trying to stay below a certain limit. You're just giving these non-conscious brain regions the right signals that allow them to regulate appropriately for your appropriate calorie intake.
This is great. This is my favorite thing ever. Satiety per calorie. Uh, I didn't hear anyone mention this. And then I started talking to Dr. Ted Naiman about it for the past 3 years. And then we searched around the internet and found you. And we're like, I think Stephan was the first one to talk about this. But people talked, were you saying that people talked about before you? I emailed you about this. Or are you aware
Yeah.
of where this concept got started?
Well, let me say that I definitely didn't invent the concept. I got it from Jenny Brand Miller's group. She's a researcher, an Australian researcher. And the paper is, first author is Susanna Holt, and it was published in 1995. And Jenny Brand Miller had been doing, I believe this history is accurate, but she is the inventor of the glycemic index. And so just to make sure people know what I'm talking about, that is a measure of how much foods increase your blood sugar. Um, and so she had been working on this glycemic index concept. And then I think it occurred to her, hey, maybe we could do the same with the satiety index. Like if we ask people every 15 minutes, how full do you feel after eating equal calorie portions of different foods? Can we take the area under the curve and say how much over time, how much fullness is this food generating compared to this other food? And they just fed people 38 common foods, which I think is a really great way to do it because, that's really relevant to people's actual lives, real foods that people actually eat every day. And then, yeah, they took those measures over 2 hours and they found that satiety per calorie differed greatly between different foods. The lowest was croissants. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a
Yeah.
super calorie dense bakery food. And then the highest was potatoes, as you mentioned. And and then they also, another cool thing they were able to do is take the properties of those foods, the physical and nutritional properties, and say what properties of a food predict higher versus lower satiety per calorie. And they found that calorie density, so the number of calories per gram, or you could think about it, the number of calories per volume, um, is inversely associated with satiety. So, in other words, the more calorie dense it is, the less satiety you get per calorie. This is kind of counterintuitive to people sometimes because they think like, if I eat something really greasy, I'm going to feel really full. And that is true, but you also ate more calories. And so if you look at that relationship, if you're doing it on a per calorie basis, those calorie dense foods actually provide less satiety per calorie. And then protein, so higher protein, more satiety. Most people probably familiar with that. and then fiber, more satiety, and then palatability. So how good it tastes. The better it tastes, the less it fills you up per calorie. And um, this, I kind of think about it in this way. And I don't know that this is literally true. This is just my way of conceptualizing it. Is that basically when something is really high palatability, when you're really enjoying it, that's a signal that on an intuitive level, your brain thinks that's a really valuable food. Because our brains are wired, they're not wired to want like, you know, kale and liver. Like our brains want like sugar and fat and just like, turn it up to the max and salt. And, and that's the stuff that really causes those brain regions to fire. And so you, where was I going with that?
Well,
Oh
are you
yeah,
talking
the
about in the
palate.
moment? They're more satiated. They're well, yeah. You're driven to eat more. Are they less satiating in the
Yeah.
moment?
Uh,
Is that what you meant by it's like?
yes. So you will experience less fullness per calorie as you eat foods that taste better versus worse. And so I think of it as your brain is like, this is a really valuable food. Let's take the brakes off a little bit so we can consume more of this really valuable food. Because maybe tomorrow will be a lean day and we won't be able to, pick French fries off the trees 3 miles away that we had to climb. That's like the logic. I think that's kind of hardwired into the brain. Like you're not going to have this opportunity again to get a food this great, so let's chow down. But actually, you do have it every day.
That's well, the evolutionary stuff is really interesting to me, and it's probably really true. That's where we're wired. I mean, it's almost like you jump ahead to the end. This is our biggest problem. Is it's the modern food environment. We can have endless whatever we want. So that's just not how we're designed.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think a lot of people object to this like logic because it's so simple. Like they want there to be some like contaminant or some like, like
Oh, it's
the
red
government
40
did this to
or
me
something.
or something like that. But I think, if you take rodents and you put a wide variety of highly palatable, calorie dense human foods in their cage, that is the most fattening diet that you can feed to a rodent. And it's the same with like bears that eat human garbage. It's the same with, monkeys that get tourist food. Like human food that we like to eat is fattening in a wide variety of animal species. It's extremely fattening. It's like the most fattening thing on the planet. And I think the story is just as simple as that when you have a wide variety of easily accessible, calorie dense, seductive foods available, you will tend to eat more than you would have in an ancestral environment with ancestral foods available.
Yes, this is great. And I still want to go a level deeper though, but it's like why? Still like one level more of why. And satiety per calorie talks about that. I want to give my little example for people to visualize this. It's like you eat a steak, you eat lettuce, you eat almost any whole food, a potato. The satiety matches the calories. It's like I don't even care the amount of calories in the steak or the lettuce because they're very different, but they're going to keep me full for the right amount of time. Satiety matches calories, they're up here. Do the opposite. You take a soda, all the calories, none of the satiety. It's not like, oh man, I had a soda. I'm like full for like 8 hours. No, it does almost nothing for your satiety, especially long term satiety. So something in between, chips, I don't know, just like sandwiches and, just kind of like American foods that aren't exactly whole foods. They're somewhere in the middle. And it's really simple to me that this is kind of explains everything because we don't have like this kind of calorie. We're not just a machine. We're not a spreadsheet. It's like to lose fat, it's a battle of hunger. I always take it to people. It's like, okay, in reality, what is it? Everyone wants to eat less, but they can't. Right. Losing fat, it's a battle of hunger. How are you going to win that battle of hunger? Well, you need to choose different satiating foods. So I guess to go beyond the food environment, yes, everyone knows our food environment is a mess. It's a joke. It's ridiculous. But like, okay, so what, like specifically, it's what you're choosing to eat, right? So it's like those foods. So it's like what specific foods and why.
So I think that's important, but I do think there's more to the story. And I think the food environment is a big part of it because, one of the things that I try to emphasize in my book is that we humans eat for many reasons, or I should say, we consume calories for many reasons. And hunger is only one of those reasons. And satiety, ending our consumption is only one of the reasons why we stop eating. So, and those are important reasons, to be clear. Hunger and satiety are obviously important, but they're not the only reasons. And so I think that, I think considering the food environment is also important. So, um, this is like my top two that I usually talk about on podcasts when people want to know like what my tips are, is the satiety thing and then the food environment. If you have foods in your environment you will that are easily eaten and seductive, you will tend to eat those, or it will be very difficult not to eat them. And and even if you're not that hungry. So sometimes you'll see a food and it will actually trigger hunger, because hunger is not like quite as linked to the body's energy status as a lot of people assume. Like, um, have you ever had the experience of like you bring a healthy lunch somewhere, like something that's totally consistent with your own goals for yourself, and you eat it and you're like totally satisfied and you like don't need to eat anything more, you're not hungry, and then you see like pizza or donuts or something or whatever, and all of a sudden you're like, man, I feel hungry again. Have you ever
Mhm.
had that experience?
Well, yes, exactly. Yeah, like
Yeah.
100 days in a row, you're full from that meal, and then the next day, someone brings ice cream, and you're like, I could eat ice cream, absolutely.
Yeah, and you're definitely like, there's a seductiveness to it, but it also will like spark, often I find, hunger as well. Even though my body doesn't need energy, I was full just a second ago, but that sensory cue, the sight of it or the smell of it, will provoke even hunger sometimes. So, yeah. Anyway, the point I'm getting, I'm being long winded about it, but the point is just that sometimes we will consume calories just because they're there and they're seductive. And so I think that's important too, to control those sensory cues. And in fact, if you look at what really correlates best with the obesity epidemic in the United States, I think one of the things that you can really point your finger at in a pretty solid way is that our we started snacking a lot more during that time. We're having more between meal eating occasions. And that between meal eating pretty much accounts for the increase in calorie intake that we experienced during the obesity epidemic. That correlates with that increase in weight population wide. We and I say snacking, that was both beverages, like sugar sweetened beverages, as well as snack foods that I think typically would be considered unhealthy. And so I think keeping a clean food environment is really important too. So I'm just trying to make that general point that I think satiety and satiety per calorie are important, but I think that if you can clean up your food environment and reduce between meal eating and reduce the temptation to eat between meals in your environment, that is also really going to support weight control.
No, very valid, absolutely. And some people really need to focus on these tips of like, yeah, get that out of your house. Like, don't leave it on the counter. I mean, these are some of the things we talked on the last episode. I'm just remembering them, and no, it's super good. But still, I still like the why stuff. I mean, okay, what are those people eating for snacks too? Right? Sugar sweetened beverages, chips, crackers. All the things people are snacking on. They're not snacking on like a hunk of chicken. They're just like, oh, I just had like chicken breast and broccoli. It was a great snack. I don't think anyone snacks on that except for bodybuilders who are very, in tune and meal prepping. But right, it's like
Yeah.
what are they snacking on?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Snacks tend to be less healthy. But just speaking for myself, just to give an example, I eat a lot of nuts, and so I had kind of gotten into the habit of between meals eating nuts, just as a snack. And I'm at home, they're tasty, and so when I would have a little hunger pang between meals, I'd go eat a handful of nuts. And it probably adds up to a significant number of calories. And I believe nuts are a healthy food. But I was starting to gain some weight. I was starting to gain a couple pounds of weight, and I said, I'm going to cut out. I can still have nuts, but I'm going to eat them with meals. I'm going to cut out all the between meal eating, and it actually took a few days for my body to adjust. Like, I would have cravings and hunger, where I'd be like, man, I really want to eat some nuts right now. And then after a few days, that subsided as my brain got used to it. But yeah, and the weight just came back off after that. um, so I think I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying, but I do think that if you're really trying to optimize for weight control, probably not eating between meals is going to be the best you can do.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely agree. And the behavioral stuff is so interesting. I'm really into the behavioral stuff or like kind of the brain stuff or the mindset stuff of like, okay, even if you know all these answers, it's like, well, how do you do it? Or it's like people eat for many reasons. People eat because they're bored. People eat because they're sad. I mean, yes, you can eat all the right foods theoretically, but you still can eat way too much or yeah, there's so many other factors.
Yeah. Honestly, this is like not going to be evidence based, but I do kind of believe this. I think people are in pain, man. I think a lot of people are hurting, not necessarily bad, but just on a daily level, just like having some level of pain with, their lives or inhabiting their bodies or whatever relationships. And there are many ways that people deal with that, like, scrolling on their phones to distract themselves mentally, or on Twitter, or eating something. And those are just little ways to like distract from the pain of just like being present in this moment. And so I think that's a thing for some people as well.
Well, I definitely think it's a thing. Dr. Tro was on the podcast that he runs an obesity clinic, and I think it was 75% of his obese patients had past trauma,
Mm,
right? It was like very big, like sexual abuse, physical abuse, like something happened in their past. And so I always say you got to set yourself up for success, right? So there's no getting past it. I mean, we're not going to solve all your problems. If you have to go see a psychologist or do some work, yes, absolutely. But also set yourself up for success by using the techniques, by eating the right foods. I mean, I had sort of this overeating type of binge eating type of thing for a lot of years. It's just like once I start, I can't stop. And once I changed the foods that I ate, I was much more satiated. So I did not want to snack and I did
mm,
not want to overeat because I'm like, I'm full. It's like, this
yeah.
is, that you got to give the people these tools so that you can win that battle, right? Yeah, you changed it and it took a little while to change, but it's like you can
Yeah.
set yourself up by eating the correct foods to help you win that battle.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I think eating the right foods and creating the right food environment, because, you know, I like to use cigarette smoking as an analogy, and it's not a perfect analogy because, you know, you don't have to smoke cigarettes. You do have to eat food,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
I do think it's similar in that modern, highly processed foods create strong eating drives that are kind of these reward driven motivations, seductiveness that is kind of similar to the seductive pull that people feel toward cigarettes or whatever. And so cigarettes is kind of an extreme analogy, but I think the analogy holds. If someone wants to quit smoking cigarettes, um, they have to be really serious about controlling their environment. So the way you do that is you don't leave packs of cigarettes laying around the house that would be easy to, pick up and smoke. You don't go to the corner store where you used to buy cigarettes. You don't go to the bar where you used to smoke cigarettes with your friends. I don't know if that's even a thing anymore, but when I was younger, it was. Um, you don't put yourself in those situations where you used to smoke, and because that cue will activate the dopamine, and then you have this motivation on your hands that's really hard to deal with. And so, and what happens is if you avoid those cues, the longer you avoid them, the smaller the motivation gets. And then, it'll be really hard for the first week. Then for the month after that, it'll maybe be somewhat hard and you'll still be craving it. But a year after that, you probably think cigarettes are disgusting. You probably will have no interest at all in smoking one. And so, the brain kind of forgets these reward associations over time. And even if it's not addiction per se, even if it's a drive that's not strong enough that we call it addiction, your brain still forgets these associations over time. And so those foods that really created a strong drive and you had a hard time controlling yourself around, if you control your food environment to where you're not giving your brain those cues, like think about it like smoking cigarettes, like quitting cigarettes, don't give your brain those cues that trigger that drive. And if you do that for long enough, you won't even really want that food very much anymore. And then it will be easier to control.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's setting up your environment, it's changing your habits. The habit change is hard, but once you get there, it's great. What do you think makes up a healthy food? Like how do you like determine what's a quote healthy food and what's not?
Oh yeah, that's that's a big question. Yeah, so I'll start with the like hedging answer, and then I'll answer it in a more straightforward way. But I think it's complicated and it really depends on circumstances, like the person and their life stage and stuff like that. Um, but if I was going to give just kind of general blanket advice for a person living in an affluent country like the United States in our kind of food environment, for the average person with average, let's say, susceptibility to obesity and diabetes and stuff, average physical activity levels, I would say probably your best bet is to, in my opinion, eat a omnivorous whole food based diet that's lower in calorie density. So omnivorous means you're getting plants and meats, and you're getting the balance of nutrients that provides. Um, you're getting enough protein. You're hopefully not having any, missing micronutrients. And whole food means that you have a lot of water and fiber coming and protein coming along with those foods that helps regulate your appetite. And then lower in calorie density means that's also going to help regulate your appetite and tend to push toward lower calorie intake. And I think, by the way, I think that kind of a diet is pretty good as like a preventative thing for people who maybe don't already have obesity or not already overweight. I think for people who already have obesity or overweight, you might want to crank up the intensity a little bit if you're trying to lose fat. Um, so you could consider something like macronutrient restriction. Probably low carb would probably be the place to start for most people. Low fat is an option as well. Some people do better on one, some people do better on the other. I think it's more common that people do better on low carb. Um, and um, and yeah, so I think that, and also I should mention, for someone who actually has obesity at this point, I think it's worthwhile to consider seeing a doctor about it as well. So not only considering diet and lifestyle, but also considering something more medical treatment, especially now that we have these more effective tools available, like the new drugs.
Well, yeah, or well, just or going to the doctor to address hormones, and there could be sleep, there could be all kinds of dysregulations. Like who knows? Yeah, interesting. Yeah, no, this is good. This is good. What do you for the audience? What are calorie dense foods? I still don't know if people exactly understand what that means.
Yeah, so I'll explain it in a little more depth then. So calorie density, the definition of that is calories per gram. So calories per weight of food. Or you could think about it, I think it's a little more intuitive to think about it as calories per volume, which correlates with weight. And the concept is if you have, let's say you have 100 calories, 100 calories of two different foods. You've got crackers and you've got oatmeal. And those have a similar nutritional composition. Let's say they're whole grain crackers, similar nutritional composition, but the oatmeal is mostly water. The oatmeal is about 3/4 water, whereas the crackers has very little water, maybe 10%. And so when you ingest those 100 calories, the oatmeal is gonna occupy a lot more volume in your stomach than the crackers for the same number of calories. And your stomach has stretch receptors in it, and that's one of the key signals that signals up to your brainstem that your brainstem integrates into this satiation or satiety signal. And so that's one of the things that determines how full you feel. And so that oatmeal, that 100 calories of oatmeal is going to make you feel more full than the 100 calories of crackers, even though you ate the same number of calories. And that's probably because it's just occupying more volume in the stomach. And this works up to a point. Like you can't just eat plain lettuce and expect that that's going to satisfy your brain. Like your brain knows that
There's
you're
not a lot of
cheating.
protein there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not going to work. But up to a point, lowering the calorie density of your food is going to help you feel more full per calorie. And this extends to other foods too. So, like a food like bacon is going to have a lot less satiety per calorie than a fresh piece of meat. Like if you took a lean cut of pork, fresh lean cut of pork, you're going to have a lot more satiety per calorie from that than you are from bacon, because bacon doesn't have a lot of moisture, whereas the pork is 3/4 water, and the bacon also is mostly fat, and fat is the most calorie dense macronutrient. And the other thing I want to say about this that I think is a key thing to understand is added fats. So like butter, olive oil, lard, those are the most calorie dense item in the human diet. And so that's a very easy way to increase the calorie density, or omitting that, an easy way to decrease the calorie density of food. And so I don't think, we don't need to demonize fat. I think fat is not an inherently bad thing and can be part of the diet. It can even be the majority of calories, and that can still be healthy. But when you're using a lot of um, added fat specifically, where that fat has been separated from the food it came from, that you're leaving satiety on the table when you're eating fat in that form.
That's a great nuance. Thank you for bringing that up. Fat is not inherently bad, but if you're looking to lose fat, why are you adding fat to everything? I mean, it's just very intuitively counterproductive, but a lot of people that are in the ancestral worlds, or more, I'm in the more animal-based world, they're like, fat's amazing. Butter's a health food. This is great. I'm like, yes, but you don't slather on everything if you're trying to lose fat. If you're an athlete and you're doing great and you're putting 2 tablespoons of butter with your eggs, good for you. You're doing great. The proof is in the pudding. You have abs, great. But if you don't,
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's just an obvious lever that you can pull if you're trying to lose fat, that I think a lot of people don't realize is a lever. The only nuance I will say is that, because a lot of times the objection that I get to this, and I want to acknowledge this objection, is people who are on ketogenic diets, like really low carb, high
mm-hmm.
fat diets. They will say, well, I eat a lot of fat. I eat a lot of added fat, and I've lost,
Oh yeah, yeah.
all this weight, and I have improved my health. And that's true, and I'm not uh, going to disagree with that. But the only thing I'll say is that um, the added fat is not what caused you to lose fat. It allowed you to be on a very low carb diet that was sustainable, and that carbohydrate restriction is what caused you to lose the fat. So it's not that the added fat is causing you to lose fat. It's more like permissive that it allowed you to be on that kind of diet. But if you're trying to optimize, and I'm sure you and Ted have talked about this a lot, and I agree with his views on this. If you're trying to optimize for fat loss, even in that context, probably cutting back on that added fat and eating fat from more whole food sources and maybe upping your protein as well, if you're able to, is probably going to optimize that fat loss more than eating a keto diet where there's a lot of added fat.
Absolutely. Yeah, that can work for a lot of people. It's crazy, not crazy. It's interesting. On the extreme edges, you can get away with a lot more. It's sort of like this different physiology almost. It's
Yeah.
like you see these high carb vegans or like what is it, the Kempner rice diet and starch
Mm-hmm.
yeah, on the very extremes, these guys could be guzzling sugar and they're like, "I don't gain weight. Sugar's not
Yep.
bad. I told you." I'm like, "Okay, you're in this whole new world on these extreme edges."
I agree. Yep, and I think it's really interesting how it works on both ends of um, the distribution. Um, and I think that's a really important observation. And another thing to add to that is the same thing happens in rodents. So mice and rats are a pretty common model of obesity, and I think they're actually a pretty good model for obesity. Like, I think a lot of the things that you see in human studies also replicate in rodents, like to a surprising degree. Like, rodents get lean at macronutrient extremes, so very low fat, very low carb. If they have obesity, you can put them on a keto diet and they will lose weight just like a human. They get super fat when you give them human junk food, just like humans do. They respond in the same way to these weight loss drugs. Those were initially developed in rodents, the new weight loss drugs, and it's just surprising to me how similar
Mm,
rodents respond to diet
yeah.
versus humans. But yeah, I think that's an important point, because if you see the same sort of thing happening at both extremes, you can't have the hypothesis anymore that only fat is the problem or only carbs is the problem. You have to have a more complex model that accounts for both of those observations, or else you're just not consistent with reality. And
Well,
that
that's
middle
yeah.
part is really the danger zone. And that's where we are in the US and in other affluent countries.
Well, yeah, it's high carb and high fat at the same time. And back to the rodent studies, how do you make a rodent fat? High carb and high fat. And then there's even the protein leverage stuff too that's good in rodents. It's like if you dilute their food of protein, it's like they have to eat more to get that protein if you're diluting it with more carbs and fat. How do you think about the protein leverage stuff?
Yeah, so my opinion of it is uh in rodents. So I'll start with rodents and then work my way to humans. In rodents, it works better on the upper end than the lower end. So what I mean by that is if you increase protein intake, so if you take their food and you just increase the proportion of protein in it, they will eat fewer calories and they will be leaner. But if you reduce their protein, they don't necessarily eat more. And especially if you go really low, they'll actually get lean again. And so I think this in humans, the evidence I've seen seems most convincing for an effect on the upper end too. Like, there's no question in my mind that eating a higher protein diet
Well, yeah.
reduces calorie intake and tends to make people leaner. I think the evidence on that, in my view, is pretty strong. Um, I'm not as clear about the other end of it,
Well,
about whether lowering protein really tends to increase calorie intake and body fatness. It seems to me that the most fattening spot is right about where we are, which is like 10 to 12% protein.
It's a bad spot to be in. But do these studies or the observation in humans account for what type of foods they're eating? Because I do agree too. There's, I don't know if it's a Simone or some population that they don't have that much protein. They're eating good seafood and they're getting some quality nutrients and protein, but maybe it is very low, but they're eating whole foods otherwise. And so, yeah, I get it. You like Okinawans. I don't know. People like, they
Yeah.
live to 100. Centenarians. It's like low pro. Well, that's what they had. They had a whole bunch of sweet potatoes and vegetables and some fish and a little bit of pork. I mean, fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's valid. So yeah, so I mean, there are many populations around the world that traditionally had very low protein intake and that do not have obesity. So I think you can't really hypothesize that this is like, this sledgehammer effect that just dominates everything else, because I don't think that's true. I don't think the human evidence bears that out. I think it could still be true. And I don't think that evidence rules out the possibility that it could still be a factor, because, these are cultures that differ in many ways from us.
Mm.
Like, their diets are just were radically different
Yeah.
than the modern American diet, and their lifestyle and their physical activity pattern and everything is different. So it's hard to really zero in on the effect of protein, but I think what you can say is it's not this like dominant force that's, you know, causing them to overeat and have obesity despite everything else.
Well, yeah, I don't think we're saying that it's the absolute dominant force. It's more the composition of the diet and whole, yeah, and their patterns of movement and all that stuff. But I wouldn't say like a standard American diet if it's filled with processed carbs and processed fats and you're eating low protein. I don't know if anyone's doing well on that.
I mean, I'm certainly not going to defend that kind of diet as optimal. Only thing I will say is that the average American is eating something like 10 to 12% protein, if you believe the USDA food disappearance data. And um, it is adequate protein for human physiology, but it's also like, we're getting fat and sick. So
Well, well,
it's,
adequate is not optimal. I mean,
yeah, I think, yeah, I agree with that. And I think there's a lot of disagreement about what is optimal, but certainly from the perspective of body composition, higher would be better.
mhm.
Yeah.
Well, let's keep going into the foods. And so you're talking about calorie density, you're talking about fiber and water. So maybe I'll start with this question. What do you think, which is the bigger lever, the bigger factor in foods and what makes them satiating or quote healthy? The fact that it's just more volume, like whole foods that have more fiber and water, or that fiber itself is magical? You know what I mean? Is there something like magic about fiber? I think fiber's fine, but you're seeing all these people who don't eat fiber at all. The carnivore guys, stuff like that. I'm not saying eat zero fiber, but you know what I mean? That you can do fiber's fine. You can eat some amounts of it, higher, lower. I think maybe I'll just answer my question first. That it's more important to eat intact whole foods that have greater volume of fiber and water than the fact that it's like, oh, fiber's magical.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on what you mean by magical. Like, I'm certainly not going to defend the concept that it's, quote unquote magical. Um, and it's not an essential nutrient, right? Like, we can recognize that right off the bat, that it's not considered an essential nutrient. So it's not like anyone expects that someone not eating any fiber is going to keel over
Hmm.
or develop, deficiency disease. I think the question is it a non-essential beneficial nutrient? And
Or
I
is it
think
that,
it,
or the question is, or is it good to eat fiber because you're good to eat intact foods? That's kind of the question. Is that the main benefit? That it fills up your stomach, it means you're eating whole foods.
yeah, I mean, I think that fiber itself is probably one of the reasons why whole foods tend to be more beneficial. Um, and I'm not saying it's the whole thing, it's probably not, but um, there are a couple reasons why I say that. One is that fiber contributes to satiety, and so it helps us eat less. It's not a key factor, so I don't think it has a huge impact on satiety, but I think it gives it a little boost. And and I think the way to think about that is, or I should say, a way to think about this. And let me be clear, this is my way of conceptualizing it. I don't know whether this is literally true, but the way I think about it is that your digestive tract, your brain kind of considers the digestive load of the foods that you're consuming. Like, how hard is the body going to have to work to process and assimilate this? And that is part of the brain's decision making about your satiety um, and eating drive. And so, if a food has more water and more volume, more fiber, if it has more like bitter and astringent aspects so that it might be harder to digest, your brain's gonna be like, okay, we probably shouldn't stuff our faces on this. This is gonna be more work and more protein too, because protein is more physiologically demanding to process. You burn a significant number of the calories that you consume
Mm-hmm.
in protein just in the processing of it. So, like with fat, you're almost getting every single calorie that you eat. With protein, you're only getting like 75% of it. So, um, all of these things that are high satiety are basically things that correlate with your body having to work harder to assimilate and metabolize what you've eaten. So I think your brain is just kind of like, it's not really worth eating a ton of this because this is too much work.
Mm-hmm.
And fiber is part of that. That's kind of how I think about it. And again, I want to emphasize, I don't know that this is literally true. This is just kind of a concept that makes sense to me, that I use to conceptualize these various pieces, how they fit
Mm-hmm.
together. Um, and so, yeah. And then there's also fiber helps to bind and remove bile acids from the body, and that affects cholesterol metabolism. So it affects your blood lipids that relate to your cardiovascular disease risk. Again, it's not a huge effect,
Mm-hmm.
but it does matter. And you see on carnivore diets, people tend to have their LDL tends to go up. Not always, but a lot of people it goes up, and often really quite dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one reason for that is the higher fiber. That's not the only reason, but that is a reason. Um, so I think fiber is tends to be beneficial. I don't think I would never call it magic, um, but I think it's just a building block of a healthier diet.
Yeah, it just seems like the mainstream paradigm is that it's magic. I kind of think it's just a proxy. It's like who's eating the most fiber? It's people eating the most whole foods. It's like kind of healthy user bias. It's kind of just like, well, you're eating less junk. So you're going to be doing better. That's why in the literature it's like everyone's like fiber, 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 fiber. Like, yeah, it's fine. It's a non-nutritive substance pretty much, right? It's like doesn't really have calories. It's just it means you're eating whole foods. It's good. Fine. Correlate. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's you. I don't think a person has to think about fiber if they're eating a whole food diet. I don't think you need to be like worrying about it or taking Metamucil or whatever. Like, if you take Metamucil, which is a fiber supplement, by the way, for people who aren't familiar, it's made from psyllium husks. It might lower your cholesterol a little bit. It may help with your bowel movements for constipation, for example. But eating a junk food diet and Metamucil is not that's not a
Sprinkle some
healthy
on the Twinkie.
diet, right? Like, so I do believe that you are going to be better off just focusing on the whole food aspect. And then if you're eating an omnivorous diet, then the fiber is just going to take care of itself. That's my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing with Dr. Ted talk about, yeah, he kind of says like, hey, if humans just eat 2 to 3 pounds of food. I think it's 2 to 3 pounds of food. It's just kind of like what you want. And so it's almost like math, where how are you going to eat if you're eating Twix bars and soda? It's not really going to work for you to get that volume of food. That's the satiety thing. And that's sort of this balance of nutrient to energy that I want to get into. So I've kind of landed on this idea of the overarching theme, is that you're looking at foods in terms of nutrient and energy. And you talked to us in the very first few minutes where you're talking about what hunter gatherers were after. Is we're after energy. And I think you said something about nutrients. It's like these are sort of different things. And I kind of try to differentiate them. I don't like the calories a calorie paradigm at all, because I'm like, all right, are we talking about nutrients? Are we talking about an oyster? Are we talking about a Twinkie? Like, what are we talking about here? And the satiety part, I'll kind of tie that into the fiber and volume of food too. It's like the satiety and what makes a healthful diet, it's not all fiber and it's not all protein. It's kind of this mix where it's like you can get long-term satiety from having adequate nutrients, adequate protein and micronutrients that you need, and some of that fiber, or well, just stomach fullness. And I ate the volume of food. So yes, omnivorous diet. Yes, I mean I eat animal based by calories, but yes, I mean I have like sauerkraut and pickles and avocado and sweet potatoes and fruit and all kinds of plant substances in their whole form. But it's like if you're asking someone to try to restrict their calories, for one, okay, what kind of calories are we restricting? I want them to restrict energy calories. I don't want them eating excess butter on everything, just like I don't want to add sugar on everything. But you can get a little bit of this leverage in the satiety thing, especially like more short-term satiation of like, okay, I had a volume of food that felt satisfying to me. And I would tell someone who wanted to lose weight, okay, let's eat a whole bunch of whole, like red meat, like whole meat, like you're saying, like fresh cuts of meat, fresh cuts of fish, eggs. And then let's add some low calorie plant foods on the side. That's going to help you. If you're eating a whole bunch of pickles and sauerkraut, they have almost no calories, but they're adding some volume to your plate. So you're like, I can stop eating. I feel good. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and it's consistent with what we've been talking about.
So, what about the specific nutrient to energy thing? Because we're putting this in the film. I think it kind of holds up when you're looking at all different diets. Okay, someone eating, say, a supposedly low protein diet, but they're eating ancestral foods and they're eating whole foods. That's actually pretty high nutrient to energy ratio.
So are you talking about micronutrients like
I'm talking
vitamins and
about protein,
minerals?
all the nutrients. So I group
Okay.
in protein and the micronutrients, and then and well, essential fats, and then you can say energy is just sort of mainly just carbs and fats, and looking at the difference between those, and like you can analyze diets from a high level and be like, okay, these diets are very opposite on paper. This is Sean Baker's diet. This is Michael Grieger's diet. Maybe I don't won't use a vegan doctor, but whatever. They can be on paper pretty nutrient dense if you're looking at the nutrient to energy ratio.
Yeah. And so I think nutrient to energy could be important for health. I mean, obviously, we're talking about essential nutrients. And so it is important to get enough of all of those nutrients. Um, I do think one kind of intuitive misconception that some people have is that we should get as much of these as possible. Really, all of these nutrients, most of them, I should say, once you have an adequate intake, there's not really any benefit to getting more. And in fact, if you take too much, you can actually get yourself in trouble. It can start to become toxic. Although that's going to be pretty rare
Mm-hmm.
from just getting from foods. But yeah, so I mean, obviously, from a health perspective, it's important to get enough of all the essential nutrients. But from a weight control perspective, I have not seen compelling evidence that micronutrients, so vitamins and minerals, have an impact on calorie intake and body
Mm.
fatness.
Well,
And so
okay, keep going.
we
I'm
can see
including
these
protein. Yeah.
we can see these correlations certainly. So someone who eats a whole food diet is going to tend to get more micronutrients, and they're going to tend to get better calorie and weight control. But to what extent are the micronutrients causal versus just being correlated? And I think they're probably just correlated. And we don't have strong evidence here, so I don't want to say this with certainty. But if micronutrients were actually something that affected your calorie intake and body weight significantly, you could lose weight by taking a multivitamin. And that would be an easy and common way to lose weight. I think everybody would know about it if it was
Yeah.
effective.
Yeah.
Um, and so I don't think that's probably causal, though, again, I acknowledge that the evidence there is not strong yet.
Well, no, that's like saying that you could eat a Twinkie and just sprinkle Metamucil on it and it's healthy. I don't think you can eat a Twinkie and just have a multivitamin. I don't think anyone thinks that, and that's not what I'm saying either. It's kind of, well, nutrition stuff is hard. It's all factors, and it's hard to disentangle all these different factors. So I get what you're saying, but okay, skip out on the food environment part. What on paper, like what do people need for a healthy diet? It's like, how can you construct a healthy diet assuming someone can just stick to it and not snack and not do it? I mean, you know what I mean? Like, then it's like, okay, what is the nutrients you need? What's the protein, vitamins, minerals you need? What's the energy you need to get through the day? I have this idea. If you look at the American diet, what's going wrong? Most people are getting not enough nutrients, not enough protein, vitamins, minerals, and too much energy. It's like right? It's like, it's just a simple kind of ratio. And this is Dr. Ted stuff. He does the protein to energy ratio, and he's saying, hey, just bump up the ratio in your favor, and you're going to do better. And so, just like saying, on paper, it's like, what do people need what foods should they eat that will get them the correct amount of protein, vitamins, minerals, and the right amount of energy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. I like uh, Dr. Ted Naiman's approach. I think, to me, the beauty of it is it's not just that it's an important concept; it's that it's a very simple concept. So it's really easy to communicate to people, and it's really easy for people to implement. And I think that is a quality that the best diet advice has, is that it's very simple to understand and to implement. So, I don't think satiety is everything, but I do think it is important. And I think that I think it is a logical thing to focus on if you want to pick one thing to focus on. And I think that's what he's trying to do is, I'm going to take this important variable and I'm going to try to max it out and focus on it in a really like simple and intuitive way for people. And, and yeah, I think I think he's done a nice job of doing that.
Well, yeah, I try to give people the heuristics. It's like, how do you think about food? Like, what can you do? Like a bit of a framework. So yeah, what do you think aside? Because I know you're into the brain stuff, and right, there's behavioral stuff, but like, what are some heuristics for a good diet? Like, how do people choose foods?
Yeah. So for me, I'm just going to come back to that really simple general guidance. Again, this can differ based on the person and the life stage, but whole food, lower calorie density, omnivorous diet, and control the food environment.
Well, basically, that is a nutrient to energy. Yeah, we've come to the same conclusion, and I get, yeah. I mean, we're in agreement. It's like, why are whole foods good? Why are ancestral foods good? It's because they have a high nutrient to energy ratio, because they are satiating, they have a high satiety per calorie. To me, it's like, why is a food bad? I asked you, what makes a food healthy or not? What is a junk food? Well, it's basically a refined food that has messed up with nature. You messed up nature's ratio, and now it's really just stripping it of nutrients. Sometimes they try to add them back in, but that doesn't work. That's not how nature works. You can't just add back in the multivitamin.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are different ways of conceptualizing similar ideas or similar guidance.
Yeah. Yeah. You can kind of come to the same conclusion. So before we go, I want to talk about the genetic stuff a little bit because I think you're interested in that as of late, and just there's this idea that some people are just genetically doomed, and or that we have this fat acceptance movement, which is good for people to accept themselves and stuff like that. But I don't buy into that they're just genetically doomed. I think there's a very small portion of the population that's genetically doomed, and if people had the right information to like stuff we're talking about, if they could eat this whole foods diet with animal foods, that they could lose fat and not be genetically doomed.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm obviously not going to use the term doomed because I think that, that's a pretty loaded term. But I think that people have different levels of susceptibility to obesity. I think that's clear. And I think most people hearing this will understand that that's true. Some people don't have to worry about it at all. They can eat whatever and they're never going to develop obesity. Whereas other people could eat, a pretty healthy diet and they might still carry a fair amount of extra fat. And that susceptibility ranges to as extreme as you care to look. So like there are people who have rare mutations where they lack leptin or the leptin receptor, and those people, unless they receive treatment, and sometimes even with treatment, are just there's nothing that can be done. Like they have extreme obesity, extreme hunger issues all the time, and that there's no diet or anything that's going to fix that. And then and again, emphasizing that that's rare. Um, and then on the other end, there are, the hard gainers or people with lipodystrophy where like they just are extremely lean and there's nothing they can do about it. They will never gain fat no matter how much they eat or try to eat. It's not going to happen. They can make themselves unhealthy, but they're not going to gain fat.
Mm-hmm.
And and then in between is everybody else. And that's where the vast majority of people are. And the average person in the US is susceptible to fat gain to varying degrees, either overweight or obesity. At this point, only like a quarter of American adults are considered in the, quote unquote, lean body mass index category. Um, and you have to consider that that's not the lifetime risk. Like that includes 18-year-olds who probably will gain fat over time. So lifetime risk probably only I don't know what the number is, but I would guess like probably only 10 or 15% of Americans are staying lean their whole lives. So that's pretty stark, right? Like that suggests that most people are susceptible to gaining fat if they're in the right, situation. But the important thing to keep in mind is that, there's this quote, genes load the gun and environment pulls the trigger. So everything that we are, from the way our bodies are to the way our minds are, our personality, our behaviors, is a gene by environment interaction. So it's not just genes, it's not just environment, it's the interaction of those two things. And so another way of saying that is that obesity occurs when a genetically susceptible person is placed into a fattening environment. And so, that obviously suggests that there's two ways to not have obesity. One is to pick the right parents, and the other is to pick the right environment. And um, so, yeah, I mean, I think it's really clear that environment, in other words, the food environment and what foods you're eating, and probably other things like your physical activity level and sleep and stress and stuff, life events, all of that can um, affect how likely you are to become fat. But if you just go with the flow in a country like the United States, if you just do the default thing, chances are you will develop at least overweight and probably obesity.
Okay. But have our genes changed in 100 years? 100 years ago, our environment was completely different, right? Our food environment was totally different. and generally people were lean, and we're doing a lot better. So what's changed is the food environment. To have our genes changed in that short time, how long does it take genes to change?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's to answer your question directly, yeah, there's no question that the environment is what's changed with the obesity epidemic. Genetics is not what has changed. The genetic susceptibility has always been there. So, if you took someone that was born, or let's say conceived in 1920, and put them into, the uterus of a woman in 2023, that person will have much higher risk, presumably, of developing obesity than they would have being born in 1920, right? So the the environment is what's changed, but there's still that susceptibility. The genetic susceptibility has to be there too. So it's both of them interacting. Um, and other thing, this is kind of a little bit of a tangent, but people didn't have obesity very often in 1920, but they weren't necessarily healthy. Um, there was a lot of nutrient
Oh yeah.
deficiency diseases back then. So in some ways, we're worse off today health wise. In other ways, we're better from an infectious disease and a deficiency disease perspective. We're actually better off today than we were.
Well, oh yeah, exactly. I mean, back then, I mean, you were trying to survive on bread and potatoes, and yeah, there. I get it. Oh, we're very tuned into that. You can be thin and still have problems too. We were pointing that out in today's age. You can
Yeah.
look at people. Yeah, I mean, there's countries like China and India that have a very low BMI, very number one and number two for type 2 diabetes. Huge thing with visceral fat. Do you get into all that stuff like visceral fat and like, you're still having problems metabolically at a normal body weight?
Yeah, I mean, I think it matters. It's not something that I have focused on a lot in my science communication, but yeah, the place where you store your fat does matter. The problem is that it's really hard to change where your body stores your fat. In fact, there's no evidence that you can change it. So it seems to be strongly genetically influenced where that fat is going to land on your body.
Well, do you know Dr. Sean O'Mara? Have you heard of this guy? Does MRI scans and focuses on visceral fat.
Not familiar.
He takes patients through these dietary changes and completely changes their visceral fat. And he does all the MRI scans. It's not cheap, but he has lots of patients.
So are they losing subcutaneous fat as
A
well?
little bit of subcutaneous fat, but it's mainly visceral fat. He just gets them off all processed foods. It's
Okay. Well, I mean, that's interesting. I think there, if you look at the published research evidence, which is, the strongest form of evidence we have, there's not really any evidence for that. So I think it would be interesting to see if that kind of thing would hold up in a,
mm.
controlled trial.
Well, I know what you mean by genetically determined. I like to
Not
read
determined,
well,
influenced.
influence the personal fat thresholds concept to me. That I think, yes, I agree there that some people and many Asians have this where they have a lower threshold to put on subcutaneous fat. Right? Yeah, absolutely. And there's some people that can get very obese and they're still not type 2 diabetic yet, right? Because they have the ability to gain so much subcutaneous fat. So I'm with you there. But I do think people have the ability by changing the composition of their diet, especially eliminating the most processed foods like high energy dense foods, that you can get rid of that visceral fat.
So, I mean, selectively getting rid of visceral, so losing fat overall, yes, definitely, including visceral fat, no question. Selectively losing visceral fat, there's really very little compelling evidence that that can be done. Um, Now, I'm not saying that it can't be done, so I'm not saying it's impossible. All I'm saying is that I have not seen compelling evidence that that's the case, and I think, if this person thinks that that's the case, that's an interesting hypothesis. They should do a study and publish it, and if it's convincing, then I'll be convinced. But for the time being, I haven't seen that. If you look at there are studies that have been done with twins and weight gain and weight loss, And what it shows is that not only do twins like gain and lose virtually identical amounts of fat on diets that increase or decrease calorie intake, but they gain and lose it in the exact same way. Like the distribution is the exact same. So it's very strongly genetically linked where on your body you're going to. And I think that's actually a big reason why South Asians tend to have a lower personal fat threshold. They seem to have a hard time gaining subcutaneous fat. Like it all seems to go right to
Oh,
the
exactly.
visceral compartment. Um, and yeah, anyway, that's all I have to say about that.
Well, yeah. Well, they have less. It's that they're more predisposed to getting health problems at a lower fat mass. So yes, it's sort of like a sad genetic roll of the dice where it's like, all right, you just have to be more careful, kind of,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, genetics is absolutely it's roulette, man.
But they
It's
haven't
not
changed.
not fair. It's just how it is.
Exactly, but I just want to make sure. So it hasn't changed. It's the food environments that's changed. I think if you're talking about the brain and how we're wired for ancestral foods, and well, for ancestral lifestyle of we want calories. So yes, I think you said 90% of people probably could have overweight in their lifetime risk.
In the
So
US, yeah.
in the U.S., so it's like, I mean, that's the same. The genetics that we had, 50,000 years ago. It's that. Yes, we wanted energy. We wanted energy back then. It's the same thing. It's not like a defect in our body. It's not like, oh, we're screwed. It's that our our modern environment screwed us.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's interesting. There are strong parallels with weight gain. Sometimes I like to take a step back and talk about a different condition because people often will have like stronger pre-existing beliefs about obesity versus other things. So sometimes it helps to step back to something else. So like blood pressure, there is data from non-industrial cultures who are transitioning onto a more like industrial processed diet, and they look at what effect that has on their blood pressure. And what you see is that in the people's, and this is from New Guinea, by the way, these data are from Papua New Guinea. In the people eating their traditional diet, which mostly was based on sweet potatoes, what you see is that almost everyone has a healthy blood pressure when they're young, and then also when they're old. Like basically blood pressure doesn't really change as they get older, and it's a tight band. Like pretty much everyone is in this really tight band of healthy blood pressure. And then you look at the industrialized population, and the young people, most of them still are in a tight band of healthy blood pressure. But if you look in the older people, the distribution spreads out. And now what you see is that some people still have a healthy blood pressure, even with that industrialized diet. They don't have a problem. But there's maybe like half of people that are trailing off on this long tail on the distribution where they are the ones who are developing high blood pressure, hypertension on that industrial diet as they age. And it's the same way with obesity. If you look historically at the distribution of body mass index, it's spread out. Like it's a lot wider of a distribution because it used to be almost everyone was lean. And now some people are lean and some people have extreme obesity. So it's those people who have the genetic susceptibility who are the ones that slide down the distribution as they age, whether it's blood pressure or obesity. So it's the environment is what changed. I agree with that. But the genetics is what creates the individual susceptibility to that new environment.
How do you think the individual's ability to manage their weight, how does that factor in? So even in the modern bad diet, industrial diet, some people you said had normal blood pressure, and as we see, some people have normal weight. But what is it that, I mean, they could be eating a totally different diet. I mean, maybe they're, eating a different diet, or they're managing their calories better, quote, managing. So I know a lot. I talk to people a lot about this over the years. It's my full-time thing is just discovering this, making the film, whatever. I talked to a lot of girls that aren't into diet stuff and they're thin. and I asked them, "How are you thin?" They're like, "I don't eat." They're like, I don't eat. I restrict." Some girl was like, "I take diet pills." Like they have the strategies when they don't know how to eat a good diet. They can do okay eating industrial foods, eating processed foods. They just have to use willpower, use diet pills, stuff like that.
Yeah. I think, if we look at the people who are lean currently in the US, I think what you would see is a mix of things. I think you would see some people who are just going to be lean no matter what they do, no matter what they eat. And then you would see some people who are lean because they're trying really hard to be lean. um, and I think probably all of us know people who are in both categories. Like I'm sure most people listening to this probably know somebody who seems to eat a lot and doesn't eat especially healthy, and yet they're lean. Maybe they're even, pretty athletic body type. Um, and then other people who are constantly like worrying about their diet and eating healthy and restricting, and yet still are overweight. And so I think there's a wide variability between people in how susceptible we are to obesity. But part of it, I want to emphasize that susceptibility can be expressed in many ways. So our personalities and our behaviors are also genetically influenced. So whether we are the type of person who's going to have a lot of willpower, whether we're the type of person who is going to try to eat a healthy diet, type of person who's going to try to restrict, or whatever the strategy is, um, that is also genetically influenced.
Interesting.
So that's part of the genetic susceptibility is, are you the type of person who's just going to go with the flow of processed foods? Or are you going to say, this is not the path I want to go down. I want to eat a different kind of diet.
There, yeah, a lot of genetic stuff. Also, it's just the energy expenditure side. Like a lot of people just fidget, move a lot of NEATs, non-exercise activity thermogenesis too. It's like, yeah, that plays a role in. I know you got to go, but I was just thinking about Dr. Michael Rose too. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He's out of UC Irvine, did a lot of the fruit fly studies, a lot of like longevity stuff, and he basically what you're talking about in New Guinea, the people that the young people were normal blood pressure, the older people, he opened me up to this idea of that when you're younger, you have more of ability to not to get away with things, right? To not get away. And then as you get older, you're less able to get away with the modern diet.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, just look at obesity rates and rates of type 2 diabetes or hypertension or coronary heart disease. They're all higher. They're all age dependent diseases. So your body becomes less resilient, less ability to maintain homeostasis as you get older. That's just a fact of life. So I agree with that. And I think part of taking care of yourself when you're younger is not necessarily, it's not all about being healthy now. It's about investing in your future self.
It is. And it's hard because people don't want to change until it's too late. And you can get away
Right.
with more when you're younger.
Why are you going to fix something that's not broke? Right.
Exactly.
Um, but it's breaking. You might not feel it, but it's breaking and you're going to feel it later. For most people. So I think it is actually really important to be able to look into the future and make choices that are supporting your future self.
That's a good note to go end on to end on. Absolutely. Even if you don't know it, you could be doing a lot of metabolic harm. Act before it's too late. We agree on the diet, change your environment, and well, we should wrap up here. What else are you working on these days? I know you do the red pen reviews. That's something. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to remind people of this, Red Pen Reviews is a nonprofit that publishes expert reviews of popular nutrition books. And so we know it's really hard for people to know what's evidence based and not. Even for me, as someone who's pretty knowledgeable, I can be reading a book and really have questions about is this true or not? And so we really get into the nitty gritty and figure it out, and then put it on our website in totally free access and in a really easy to absorb format. So you can land on the page, and in just a few seconds, you can have a pretty good idea of how evidence-based the book is. So we're really trying to demystify these these diet books as far as that's possible. So yeah, we're at redpenreviews.org. Definitely check it out.
And did you do a recent one, Art and Science of Low Carb Living? Is that?
Yeah, the most recent review is Art and Science of Low Carb Living.
And just if you have one more minute, we're talking about just how to not get stuck in a dietary camp too, right? Or like getting, there's all this politics. It's like, oh, I'm on the left, I'm on the right. And, just how to, if you have a few more words on that.
Yeah, so I think this is a really pertinent topic in the diet world. I think that people tend to get attracted into tribes or camps. I think the word tribe really captures it really well, because there's this aspect of like in-group cohesion and in-group kind of defense. And it's really, I think it's really analogous to politics, as I was saying when we were talking before we went on the air. People tend to align into these camps or tribes, like, you could say Democrat or Republican, and they tend to adopt the beliefs of that tribe, even if those beliefs are not necessarily consistent or logical. It's just like, this is my tribe, this is who I am, and this is what I believe. And we've come up with ways to like make it make sense, but really the underlying reason is that that's our tribe. And this is I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad thing. It's we're human beings. We're an extremely social species. We form tribes. That was and is important to what we are as a species. But at the same time, it can have some downsides, because it can cause us to have conflicts that are unnecessary. It can cause us to believe things that are incorrect, because that is just what people believe in this tribe. And so I think that, same as in politics, you see it in diet. People often align to these tribes, and there are certain tribal beliefs that come along with that tribe that people tend to believe. And yeah, so I just think that's a pitfall people should be aware of. Like, that's human nature. That's how the human brain works.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're the kind of person who's trying to get the most accurate understanding possible of nutrition and physiology, you should be aware of that, very human tendency to get attracted to a tribe and to adopt beliefs that are not necessarily all logical or consistent.
It's a good message. I've kind of tried to do that myself over these years of doing this, is like, zoom out, don't get caught, be unbiased, and things will be better. You'll understand the world better.
Yeah, I agree. I do want to say, like, I think I understand why people get into these tribes too. Like, I don't want to say it's like necessarily all bad. And it's certainly easy to understand. Like, these are communities that are supporting each other. People are supporting each other, they're making friends. And again, we're human beings. We want support and community. And so I totally understand why people do that. I understand why it happens. But again, I think it's not the path if you want to have the most accurate understanding of the world that you can possibly have.
It's true. And I've seen it go wrong too, because if you're too in the tribe, then you have this problem with your diet and you're like, it's not that. And then it is that. And they come out and they're like, oh, yeah,
You're
I
just
didn't need.
not doing the diet hard enough.
Yeah. Oh, man. Awesome. So redpenreviews.org. And then do you have like a personal website or social media?
Yeah, I'm most active on Twitter, and my Twitter account is s.guyenet. S-Guyenet, no dot. Yeah.
They'll find you. Read the book, The Hungry Brain, for sure, everyone. And thanks for coming on.
All right. Thanks, Brian.